A sourdough starter is a living culture of flour and water and is a pathway to delectable artisan-style breads, pancakes, and more. Properly cared for, a sourdough starter can last indefinitely. Some bakers boast starters centuries old, passed down through generations, each batch of bread a link to the past. Here we follow a very simple and easy-to-follow guide by Little Spoon Farm, Amy in the Kitchen. Be sure to check out her channel. Stay tuned to the very end for some extra tips on what to do with sourdough discard. Let's get into it. You will need filtered water, 50% whole wheat, and 50% all-purpose flour, utensils, glass or plastic containers, and measuring jugs.
On day 1, you're going to add 1/2 cup of the 50-50 flour mixture and 1/3 cup of filtered water to your jar. Use a spatula to stir this up really well, making sure that you get all the dried clumps incorporated. Then you're just going to scrape down the sides really good. I like to take some water on a rag and just kind of clean up around the sides of the jar a little bit. Put the top on the jar and then let that sit for 24 hours. On day 2, we're not going to add anything to the jar. You can see that there's hardly any bubbles. I see maybe one. So what we're going to do is just give it a little stir. This will just help incorporate some air into the mixture. And that's it. Put the top back on and let it sit for another 24 hours. Okay, this is the morning of day 3, and as you can see, there's lots of bubbles on top of the starter, so it is nice and active. Okay, so now that we are on day 3 and we have kind of let this sit, we're going to go ahead and start discarding and feeding every single morning. So what you want to do is get a clean jar, and let's just go ahead and stir up the starter a little bit. Then we're going to take 3 tablespoons of the starter and put it into the clean jar. Okay, we'll take this starter, and this will either go in your compost or you just discard it, just throw it away. To this, we're going to add 1/2 cup of the 50-50 flour mixture, the whole wheat and all-purpose flour. And then we're going to add 1/3 cup of filtered water. And let's go ahead and give that a really good stir. Just remember, you always want to make sure that you're really incorporating everything together really well. You don't want any dry spots in this. Okay, and then if there's anything on the sides, I like to take my filtered water and simply just clean that up. All right, so at this point, you're going to start seeing some activity every single morning. So I suggest just taking a rubber band and putting it around the jar at the level that the starter is, and that way you can see every morning if it's risen and fallen and just kind of gauge the activity. So what we're going to do is put the top back on, and we're going to let this sit for 12 hours. It's been 12 hours since our AM feeding, and you can see that the starter has risen, about doubled, and if you look on the top, there's lots and lots of activity going on. So we're gonna go ahead with our PM feeding, and we're not gonna discard anything. We're simply going to add 2 tablespoons of flour, and then a tablespoon and a half, about a tablespoon and a teaspoon or so, just to make it easy. We're just going to stir this right into the starter. This is going to feed it while it's sitting overnight so it doesn't run out of food, to keep building up the yeast in the starter. So by doing this method where we are discarding and feeding in the morning and then just simply adding a little bit of food in the evening, we're cutting down on a lot of waste. Okay, so we're just scraping down the sides as usual. I always just like to go and clean up around the inside of the jar. So, and then clean the rim, just make sure there's no gook. That's basically what you're doing. I just like to keep everything pretty clean. Okay, so we're going to put the top back on. I'm going to slide this little rubber band up just so I know where it started. All right, so we're just going to let this sit on the counter again, and I'll come back on day 4 and I'll let you see what it looks like on day 4 in the morning. It's the morning of day 4, and you can see there's plenty of bubbles on the top of the starter. So we're going to go ahead and do our discard and feed. I'll see you in 12 hours for the PM feeding. This is the evening of day 4, so we're going to give it a PM feeding. I'll show you what it looks like tomorrow morning. It's the morning of day 5, and I just want you to see the top of the starter. It is very liquidy, and that just means that the yeast are getting more and more hungry. They're eating a lot of the food that we're giving it, and so it didn't rise at all. Actually, it may have risen and gone back down overnight. I can't really tell, but this is perfectly normal, okay? You do see the bubbles and everything on top, so that's really what you're looking for. So again, this is the morning of day 5, so I'm going to go ahead and do the AM feeding. we'll be back for the PM feeding in just a little bit. Okay, we're at the end of day 5. You can see that it has risen and there's bubbles. See if you can see the top there. So let's go ahead and give it its nightly feeding. Alright you guys, it's the morning of day 6, and if you see on top lots of bubbles, it did rise overnight, and I'm not sure if you can see it right here in the back. There's this line. It rose and then it fell back down. So at this point I'm going to assume that it's not strong enough to bake bread, so maybe another day or 2. So let's go ahead and just do our normal AM feeding. See you in 12 hours. It's the evening of day 6, and I just want you to see that the starter has doubled in size. So it is very active. You can look on the top and see lots and lots of bubbles. So this is what you should be seeing on the evening of day 6. Let's go ahead and give it its feeding. This is the morning of day 7. It rose and fell. So I'm gonna give it a morning feeding, and then in about 4 or 5 hours, we're gonna do a float test to see if this can actually be used to bake bread on the 7th day. So I'm gonna go ahead and discard and feed it with the normal AM feeding. It's been 4 hours since I have fed the starter on day 7 in the morning, so you can see it is doubled. So what I'm going to do is what is called a float test, and that is where we take a small portion of the starter and put it into a bowl of warm water, or I'm not sorry, not warm water, a bowl of room temperature water, and if it floats, then it's ready to bake bread. And you can see the starter is floating. So I'm going to go ahead and use this starter in a loaf of bread, and I will show you the results. Here you go, guys. just finished baking this about an hour ago, and you can see that it has a really good rise. Really nice oven spring. Nice and golden. So let's go ahead and slice this open and we'll see what the crumb looks like. And there you have it. It's possible to create a sourdough starter that will give you bread in about 7 to 8 days.
Sourdough discard. The portion you remove during feeding need not be wasted. Use it in crackers, pizza dough, or for thickening soups, adding a subtle sour note. To store your starter long-term, refrigerate and feed it weekly. If you're taking a break, you can even dry it out or freeze it for future use. Properly cared for, a sourdough starter can last indefinitely. Some bakers boast starters centuries old, passed down through generations, each batch of bread a link to the past, with the oldest serving sourdough mixture supposedly over 4,500 years old.